A blessed day, a blessed evening to all of you, those who are joining us through this live stream celebration of the Mass here at the Shrine of Jesus, the Divine Word. As I used to do during these weekdays, that I focus the reflection on the first reading. Today, we continue to meditate on these readings that are taken from the so-called post-exile writings, meaning around the 5th or 6th century before Christ, after the exile of the people of God from Babylon. There were several writings, and one of them we have heard today, that of the prophet Haggai. And one of the chief concerns of these writings, several writings, the so-called post-exile writings, is the reconstruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, which, when they returned from Babylon, it was in ruin. And that was the concern of these writers. Now, one of the main concerns, because there was this idea that the temple, that God must have a temple now. And in today's reading, the Hebrew people started to reconstruct that Temple of Jerusalem after their Babylonian exile. It is precisely to this enterprise, which continues very slowly, that Haggai, the prophet we have heard today, dedicates his preaching, his first preaching, in fact, about the reconstruction of this Jerusalem temple. The prophet Haggai, in a fairly simple words, plain words, lashes out against the lack of passion or inertia of the leaders of the community in this rebuilding. No? It passed already, according to the first reading, 2 years after their arrival, and they were moving so slowly. No? So the prophet Haggai preached against them, their stinginess of these returnees. They were not very generous, and they were not very committed in the reconstruction of the temple, which, according to historians, would be completed only after 5 years. That's why we hear the preaching of Haggai today a bit harsh in his words against this lack of commitment of the people in the reconstruction of the temple. The appeal of the prophet Haggai, therefore, is transformed into a kind of a critique to their egoism and exaggerated individualism, against excessive privatization and the narrowing of their social horizons, which is also our experience in the contemporary society. The words of the prophet interrogate us, believers, of the quality of our sense of community and of our fraternal relationships. What can we learn from this on the concern of the prophet for the reconstruction of the temple? Does God really need a temple? As a young religious priest preparing for the missions, I remember that we were reminded very often by our formators in that missionary work is not primarily about building constructions, but they insisted on the formation of a vibrant Christian communities. The thinking is that even if you have beautiful buildings, churches, but if you have a lousy community, if you do not have committed Christians, what's that for? No. So the emphasis they had brainwashed us. No, going to mission, it is not your task. They said no, to be builders of physical temples or churches. Primarily, our mission is to form communities, vibrant communities. But my experience too, in working in the missions, particularly in Argentina, that although this is not, the construction is not the main concern, but as I observed that as a community, Christian community grows and matures, and as the people see their material needs, for example, of the community for a church, a chapel, and this community start to form and build their own. And I observed that when a community that is formed well, it's easier to launch projects such as construction, physical construction for their needs. In fact, I saw that such projects strengthen the members of the community in their relationship with each other, and their projects becomes a manifestation of their maturity as a Christian community. That's why, on the one hand, yes, it is true that the emphasis is on the community, but also on the other hand, as the community matures, they would see their need for such beautiful temples, churches, as a testimony also of their unity and of their mature faith. Does God really need a temple, a house in our midst? Strictly speaking, God, being a spirit, I think doesn't need a temple. The whole creation is His. But we limited creatures are the ones in need, I think, of particular places, particular times as markers and reminders of our need to encounter God. So temples, church buildings, chapels, days, special occasions like Sundays, Christmas, etc., are signposts to remind us of our vocation and need to be in communion with God and with one another. In the final analysis, God's insistence of the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem through the prophets is for the people and not for Him primarily. God wishes to remind us of our calling to be in communion with Him and with our fellow followers. The temple, the church, is a symbol of our vocation to communion. May we grow in our awareness and our commitment towards communion, towards unity as followers of God. And when there is, as I've said, vibrant Christian community, it is easier to pursue projects like building monuments that would help us, or temples that would help us grow in our communion with each other and with God. May the Lord, who has called us as His children, grow in our desire towards communion with Him and towards our communion with each other. And that is what the temple, the church, stands for, that we are called to communion, to unity as children of God.